Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Mr. Productivity Podcast. If you haven't done so already, please hop on over to my website, MrProductivity.com. Lots of goodies for you there. Speaking of goodies, I have a goodie for you today. Dr. Diane Hamilton, she is all about curiosity. I'm so excited for this, Diane, because we actually had before we started recording, a little curiosity. We're trying to figure out how to get the echo to stop on the podcast. And you said, boy, you're curious. I'm like, oh, I got to figure out how things work. So I think that is just a natural segue into our conversation today. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. And I love that because I would have had to stay here forever until I figured it out. So I don't know about you, but I've still been here till tonight. But I'm very excited to be on your show. Thanks, Mark.
So you have a new book coming out, Curiosity Unleashed. And I think, tell me, because you're the expert on curiosity, I think that as we get older, we become less and less curious. When we're kids, we're like, oh, how does the frog jump? And how does this work? But as we get older, we're like, I don't care. Is that true?
Yes, it is. It is. You've obviously been reading some of the stuff that's out there because it's so fascinating to me what happens to our levels of curiosity. And that's what got me into this realm of what I study now. We peak around the age of 5, which is very similar to what they see with creativity. And that made me very fascinated to find out what happens to it. Because if you look at what happens with creativity and curiosity, there's some really interesting TED Talks that I think people should check out. One of them I think is interesting is Sir Ken Robinson talks about what happens to creativity and how schools educate us out of our abilities. And then another one is by George Land, who studied children at NASA and found that when you're really young, you're super creative genius. And then by the time you're 31, almost no one is, and almost everyone is when they're little. So what happens to that? And that's what I wanted to know. And I was really frustrated because no one really told me what stops the curiosity. They would just tell you, this is what happens. Here's your score. You can measure your curiosity. You can tell me if I have high or low. And if you have low, then what do you do? And that's why I did my research, because if I had low, which I didn't, but if you did, you would want to fix that. And we all do in some respects. Not everybody's got high levels. When Daniel Goleman was on my show talking about emotional intelligence, he was saying you can be great in this area and not so great in this other area of emotional intelligence. Same thing with curiosity. So that's what sparked my interest, to find out what happens to us in our childhood or past that to make us lose our levels of curiosity.
You said that we peak at curiosity at 5?
Yes. Crazy, huh? That's about when you go to school. Think about that.
Okay.
You get into schools, and I'm not blaming it on teachers, but I'm just saying you're in a system where you cannot ask questions all day long. You would get everybody off track. So there is some of that influences it, and we'll get into it later as we progress with whatever you ask me, but there are things that inhibit curiosity. And I think it's interesting to see the impact of when you're young, and kids ask 100 questions a day, but if you were in a class, it would be pretty hard to do that and have anything accomplished. Even though I'm sure a student like me probably did it.
I recently celebrated my 59th birthday, and I am still naturally curious. So why do some adults like you and me, we can maintain this sense of curiosity, but sadly, I know a lot of people, they're just like, who cares?
I think we're going to always need worker bees and people who do the things that you don't really need to be super curious to do. But I think if you want to be super successful, my basic premise is curiosity is about getting out of status quo thinking. And if you keep doing things just because they worked great in the past and you just get into this, you're just existing and you're not really living. And I think that there's a lot of people, even if you took my assessment or if I take it, we won't be perfect on it. There's going to be things that we need to improve. It is sometimes surprising, the things that we think we're curious and then we're like, I thought I'd do better on that, or I thought I'd do differently. So I think that a lot of it is your environment. If you've ever read Wozniak's book, he was really interesting when I talked to him. And I liked the part of his book where he said his father would bring home all these kinds of gadgets and things from his work. He was like literally a rocket scientist. I can't remember exactly what his job was. But he brought home all these gadgets and he'd teach young Wozniak, like, here's what you do. You hook this and this, you need this because electricity does that. And whatever, he would give them real detailed explanations. And when you have that kind of exposure in your environment, that can make a big impact. But if you don't, then that explains a lot of the people when you say, why don't they? A lot of it is where we grow up and the exposure we have.
Is it possible for someone who is not curious now to become, this may sound like a silly question, to become more curious as we age? Is there something, as I'm visiting someone listening to this show or watching it and they're like, oh, I'm not very curious, but is there hope for me? What say you?
Yeah, there's definitely, it's like emotional intelligence. And I keep referring to that because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on emotional intelligence. So I could see the correlations of what I found then, what I'm finding now with curiosity. It's very much something that we can change. And a lot of it is recognizing what it is that holds you back. And when I assess people in organizations, I give them my assessments, which is just similar to an emotional intelligence test, where you get levels of different things and you can work on them and you can create plans of actions to overcome some of this. But you don't really know how to do that unless you find out what's stopping you. So that's what I think is really important. I think a lot of people just don't look into it. They just assume this is as curious as I'm going to get, or this is, I don't really care. There's a lot of your assumptions that go into this. Like, oh, I don't really care about that. When I was young, I learned that. It just wasn't fun. And a lot of it is the teachers you've had or the parents' comments and the things that our family only does this. You don't want, siblings are brutal. They'll tell you what you think is stupid. There's so much that can inhibit us that it leads to what we tell ourselves, that I'm not going to want this. And then it all leads to fear. And there's just so many aspects of what keeps people stuck in their ways. And a lot of it is your success, because your past success will hurt you sometimes. Right now with ChatGPT and everything else that's come out, if you're trying to do things the way you used to do them, people are going to pass you standing still. And it's a thing that a lot of people don't recognize. They get very comfortable with success and they go, that worked, I'll just keep doing that. But then tell that to Kodak and Blockbuster, how great that worked for them.
Heard a story about a lady who escaped North Korea. A real famous author. She wrote a story how she actually got into China and then back into South Korea. And I went down that rabbit hole. I went and Googled the top documentaries on YouTube on North Korea because I was curious about it. Here's this country we know very little about. Right. And that just piqued my curiosity. And then if we want to take it to the other extreme, I'm a daily runner. So one day I was coming back from a run. And as I was running through a neighborhood, I saw a possum, and the possum just stopped. It was looking at me, but it wasn't moving. And I stopped and looked at it, and it's like, I'm not moving. And I just thought that was so interesting. I got very curious about it because it probably, with its long claws, could probably tear me to pieces. And yet it stopped and looked at me to wait till I passed by. And I was very curious about that. So I did some research when I got home. So I think, is that what you're talking about when if you find something, you're like, I don't know the answer to that. Let me go do some research.
Yeah, it's funny because I was talking to my husband about this morning. He started watching the Napoleon movie that's out right now on streaming or whatever. And he said, he was telling me all this stuff. And I thought he had more negative things associated with him. And then he goes, no, when he starts looking up stuff. And my mom's name's Josephine, his wife's Josephine. So my mom always says, everyone knows his wife's name is Josephine. And I'm like, no, they don't. But now they will, I guess. But I started to look a little bit into that this morning. So you find things that you don't know much about, and I don't know anything about Napoleon really. And so I'll probably spend all afternoon looking up Napoleon, thanks to my husband. Your story reminded me, I was in Hawaii and I ran into a giant pig. It was huge. He was right in front of me, like a foot away from my foot. And I thought it was really interesting. And my instinct wasn't to run away, it was to stare at him. And then later everybody goes, well, these are going to be good to be around. But that wasn't immediately in my head. He was looking at me, I was looking at him, nobody was bothering each other, and we just moved on.
So now I'm curious, what was the pig thinking? Because of course we don't know, they don't speak English, but I'm like, he or she is looking at you, and you're looking at the pig, and we know what you're thinking, but were you curious about what the pig was thinking?
What came to mind, I used to teach a course. I've taught thousands of online courses throughout the years. And I taught a course where the book required was The Pig Who Wanted to Be Eaten. The book. And I cannot remember the pig story from it because it was a book about ethics, and it was actually an interesting book. I recommend it, but I don't think he wanted to be eaten. But I think he was just too lazy to move. He looked a little heavy. I mean, I think he was just nice, happy, sitting where he was. Maybe he just eaten.
Probably saying, "Excuse me, lady, I don't have the energy to walk around you, so can you move so I can go in a straight line?" What about, now this podcast is geared toward leaders and stuff like that, but do you think people who are going to school, university, college, whatever you call it in your part of the world, do you think that curiosity plays a part in your success in learning what you went to school for?
Oh, definitely. Learning's such a big part of what we're trying to teach people. Effective learning. You want them to be critical thinkers when they're learning. And I think in the courses I teach, I try to incorporate a lot of aspects to that. I think a lot of people, and it's going to get worse with things like the AI, they want to copy and paste from Wikipedia or ChatGPT and then just say, hey, look what it does. And I won't let them do that. I make them paraphrase their citations instead of directly quote anything. And what that does is show me that they learned something, that they actually digested the information instead of just were really good at citing an APA format or whatever it is that they have to do. And they don't like it sometimes because it's so easy to just copy what the author and say, this supports my point. But that doesn't show me that they figured out what that guy's or that gal information really meant. And that's something I think we need to do more of at work. And I don't think leaders ask for enough feedback. I've had so many curiosity experts and people on my show, and a big HBR article that the case for curiosity, it comes up a lot. And a lot of leaders think that they encourage curiosity in their workplace. And if you ask them, they will say, oh yeah, I do. But if you ask the people that work for them, they'll go, out of much. So yes, we need to encourage it, and we need to reinforce the importance of learning and doing it through critical thinking and research, not nerdy research in your work day so much like what I make my students do. But in your working setting, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And so you don't know where to explore. And I had a really interesting guy on my show. His name is Olin Odakoven, and he's since passed. He was a really great guy, and he had an education company. And he would just find people at meetings or wherever he was talking. And when he was talking to them, if he found them really like they had something on the ball, he would hire people without even having a job description or anything in mind. And he would just put them in the company and see what they were good at and then devise a whole job around what they were good at. And I always thought that was the coolest thing. I would love to have somebody do that for me in every job, because everybody just makes assumptions of what people are good at or what they like to learn or what they're going to naturally do. Having worked in sales for so many decades, everybody assumes that I was really into this part of sales. And then what I really loved was the paperwork and the nerdy stuff. And no one would have thought that, because no salesperson in their right mind would like paperwork, right? So we can't make too many assumptions for other people.
A funny story about AI. Recently, my wife was doing some research, and some kind of research for medical or something. And as she's reading the article, it went from what she's looking for, and she started talking about plants and the synthesis. And she goes, what is it? So someone probably copied and pasted the article and just mushed it in one article. She's reading about a human thing, and all of a sudden it's talking about photosynthesis and plants, and she's, what's going on right now? So I think AI is a great tool. I use it. I love it for my podcast, because I'll take this transcript and I'll put it in the Claude AI, and I say, okay, write me a readable blog post, because nobody wants to read a transcript. And it'll actually take the transcript, it'll make subheads, and it'll take the key points. And then I got my blog post. And I'll say, okay, give me a 1 to 3 sentence podcast episode description. Give me a meta description. But I don't just copy and paste it. I use my brain. I'm like, all right, that doesn't make any sense. But one thing I noticed, that I love Claude AI. That's what I'm using right now. There's ChatGPT. There's a million of them out there. I notice that they struggle with counting. So I'll say, I'm creating a tweet, make it for 260 characters or less. It'll give me like a 350 character. I said 260 or less. So apparently AI is pretty smart, but it can't count. So
no, the math is bad. I argue with mine all the time. No, what's interesting, I just did a big research project and I thought, oh, I really hate running the statistics myself. I could go and do it. But I thought, oh, I want to see how ChatGPT or one of the other ones does if I put it in. I happen to use Chat for this one because they had the newest version and I just wanted to see what it would do. And it came up with the nicest, most beautiful data. It told me glowing things based on my data, how wonderful it was. And I was happy with my data, don't get me wrong. But the charts were just perfect. And then I started to look at this information. And then I'm like, wait a minute, I had 51 people in my study. Why is it telling me I had 150? And then I started looking again. And it started to tell me that certain CHROs said this and that. And I didn't have any women CHROs in my study at all. It gave me just completely random, wrong. So I ran it all manually myself in Excel and did my own data. Wasn't even close to what the data was. And I started asking him, like, why would you do that? And just, and it just says, oh, sorry. And here's the better. And then it was still couldn't give it. I don't think it's ready to do data, to numbers. I think it's okay for what you're talking about. It's great for coming up with a summary sentence to get you an idea of what you want to do. Oh yeah, if I put it in that order, that's a good idea. If I have chapters about this or whatever in paragraphs. I think for formatting and idea generation, what would be a great title for my article kind of thing? Oh yeah, and then you just change it to whatever. That stuff, it's wonderful. But I think it will be great. But if you're doing research, do not rely
100%.
math.
100%. I love having, because I hate coming up with titles for my episodes. And so I just say, Claude, give me a couple titles. What do you, and which one do you think is the best? Because what it'll do, it'll actually in a microsecond analyze the transcript of our conversation and come up with a title. But I noticed that it likes using the word unlock. So now I have to put in my prompt, I need 2 to 3 SEO titles. Do not use the word unlock because I don't want every one of my podcast episodes to have the word unlock in it.
But you can set the settings, I know,
Yes.
and tell don't use these words. I don't use these words. I don't like them, and they still do it sometimes, though.
Yes.
No.
What are you, a child?
I get in a lot of arguments, and I really do. I'm like, what are you thinking?
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to Curiosity Unleashed, your new book coming out. When is it coming out, by the way?
Next month.
Wow, July.
It's very exciting because it's a follow-up to my book, Cracking the Curiosity Code. And it's so weird because I wrote that book because I wanted to write about curiosity because I'd been interviewing so many people on my show, from Steve Forbes to Ken Fisher to Daniel Goleman, and all the top people had been on my show. And all the smartest minds were just so super curious. It was just fascinating to me to interview somebody like Keith Kroc from DocuSign and how curious he was. And I thought, I want to write a book on curiosity because I found some of my students weren't as curious as what they'd be. And I wanted to solve that problem. But about halfway through the book, I started to realize I need to solve this, and I got to find an assessment that determines the things that inhibit curiosity so you can fix it. Just like with emotional intelligence or any DISC or whatever you're working with, there's got to be an assessment out there. And there wasn't. There's a great assessment by Todd Kashdan and his group that tells you if you're curious or not, and levels. Might be highly curious or low or whatever, and you need that to do research, to find out if people are changing. So that's a great study. But I wanted one that tells me, no, this is what's stopping you. And so I hired all these great statisticians because the AI wasn't available back then to give me wrong answers. So I got actual statisticians who gave me the wrong thing, which was interesting because they were stuck in status quo behaviors of doing the way that Todd had already done, which I'm like, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. He did a great job. So this is what I want. And I couldn't get any of, I was hiring like really high level people. So I decided I'm going to take my advice, get curious, and figure out the stats myself, which I really don't love. Factor analysis it's doable. And I ended up creating my Curiosity Code Index, and it determined that 4 things inhibit curiosity. And that information led to just life-changing things. That's why I'm on Thinkers 50 radar. And some of these groups had found this as like very big for thoughts in the leadership community, right? So that writing the first book was more about the value of curiosity and some of that kind of general stuff. Then I started to give the Curiosity Code Index to so many different organizations, big organizations. And I was doing a lot of curiosity research with really big organizations, the Verizons and Novartis and the LinkedIn Well, you name the company. I was working with them and I thought, this is so important what I'm learning. And what I kept coming back to was a new definition of really getting out of status quo behaviors is how I see curiosity for the workplace. That there's just so many companies like Blackberries and all these things that we thought were going to be so successful and be here forever. And when was the last time you saw somebody on a Palm Pilot? They're just gone. So I wanted to share not only just all I learned from people taking the Curiosity Code Index and everything else, but all these examples of companies who failed or that failed and those that succeeded, as well as individuals who are super successful because of being curious. The Oprahs and the normal people, the Warren Buffetts and the Elon Musk and the people, whether you love them or hate them, they're super successful from their curiosity. So that's where I went with this book. And I'm really proud of it. I think it's going to be really different. And there's nobody really talking about how to build a culture of curiosity. They talk about the value of curiosity. So I wrote that. But this is how you create one. And here's what you get if you create it financially. That was really important to me because you go to leaders and they're like, yeah, it's probably good financially. I get that. And actually, I asked ChatGPT to give me financials. And now I know better to do that. But at the time, I asked it, and it would it's intuitive. It ties into innovation, and engagement, and productivity, of course. So it was telling me, oh, dummy, whatever, just respond back to me. And so I kept looking for research, and no one really has done anything. And that's why this research I was talking to you about before is so important, because I finally did some found out from I did C-suite executives to find out what they were doing to improve curiosity and what their financial benefit was. And so this is not like a researchy paper that you can't read. This is written in stories of companies and different things. It's very easy to understand. And I think it's so important for organizations. And I really think that curiosity is the next kind of big thing that Bern Harnish said it was the competency of the future. And all these people have said these important things on my show. And so that's why I wrote this book, because everything since, I think that book was 5-6 years ago when I wrote that book. I've written a couple between, but when I wrote the first book, there's so much I've learned since then that I wanted to share that's completely different.
Funny thing about, you mentioned Forbes, and this is a funny story. Back in 2009, I entered a contest online to win a trip. It was sponsored by Forbes and to stay at the Forbes Chateau in Normandy, France, Bellois, France. And I entered and I won. My wife and I got to go in June of 2010. We actually stayed at the Forbes Chateau, and it was so surreal because I've only been out of the country once, and that's when I used to live in Rochester, and I'd go to Niagara Falls all the time. It really wasn't going to another country because I only went to the other side of the Rainbow Bridge there. But it was so bizarre that this Forbes Chateau used to be a Nazi hospital during the war. The Ford family actually been there. We saw signature books, Elizabeth Taylor. I mean, it blew me away. We had access. We were the only people there that week. And to know that the Forbes family was at the chateau and all these famous people were there, even now, 14 years later, I'm just like, wow. That's one of those moments that I share with people, and like, you entered a contest once? Yeah, I just entered my email address and just forgot about it. And all of a sudden they sent me a certified letter, you won. I'm like, what's happening now? So I just had to put that, because you're talking about the Forbes, Stephen Forbes.
Did you get to meet Steve? Because I know Steve Fruity.
Oh, no, they weren't there.
Well, you would like him. He's a really great guy. I'll have to ask him. I'm on a board with him. So I'll have to ask him that chateau. Apparently
they sold it a couple years ago. It was amazing because you got to go to his office and they had the bedrooms and stuff. It's an amazing chateau. What's interesting is it was built before a country was a country, which still blows my mind. Gorgeous property. So just go look up the Chateau de Bellois in Normandy, France. It is, and I remember how to spell it. It's Bal-e-Roy. So that's how you spell it. Baleroy. R-O-Y. I'm sorry. And I just can't, 14 years later, Diane, I still can't believe we were at this place. I didn't want to go visit France. I just wanted to stay at the chateau. It's so beautiful. So I just wanted to put that in there because you mentioned Stephen Forbes. It was awesome.
I'm definitely asking him about it next time I see him, because
I wonder, ask him when he sold it, because my wife is the constant researcher and she found out that they sold it a couple years ago, which broke my heart. But they used to have balloon festivals there because he has his backyard is not like we think of backyards. His backyard is like a massive backyard. And they used to have, I guess they had the Bellois or Normandy Balloon Festival there or something. We didn't get to see that, but we were amazed when they had servants there. We had servants there during the day.
Yeah.
And they would go home at night. Now, keep in mind, this is small rural France. This is not like living in Houston, Texas. There's no like grocery store. Everything closed at 5 o'clock. It was so bizarre. But I remember sitting out there our first night after the servants went home. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it is so quiet. I haven't experienced that kind of peace and quiet since. I think I was hearing traffic in Houston. It was crazy how quiet it was there, but it was beautiful.
Oh, that's awesome. He's such a nice man. And I think he would be happy to share that with me. But I think that Forbes' name has been a really interesting thing to find the things they do. They do those cruises and I know they just had one because Rich Karlgaard's been posting about it, that they just were on one of those. I've never gone on one of those Forbes cruises, but they still do some stuff like that.
Oh. So let's get back to curiosity. I thought it'd be curious to share that with the audience. See what I just did there.
Great.
I wish I created it myself, but it actually happened to me. So you mentioned the 4 things that contribute to curiosity. Would you care to share those secrets with us?
Happy to. We touched on them, but not formally. So I want to go over them formally. It's just so you can remember them. I created the acronym of FATE, F-A-T-E. So F is for fear, and I'll go over each one separately, but A is for assumptions, T is for technology, and E is for environment. So fear was not surprising to me. One of the first questions I asked was in a LinkedIn group, just asking people what held them back from being curious. And almost everybody had a fear-based thing that they said.
Wow.
And I assumed that was going to be the main thing and maybe one of the only things. At the beginning, I didn't know what was going to hold people back from being curious. Because we sometimes have leaders who inadvertently say things. Some of them were taught to say, don't come to me with problems unless you have solutions. And then there's basically saying, if you don't know how to fix it, don't tell me I have a problem, which is not a good thing. And then people get freaked out and we are in meetings. You don't want to ask a question. You don't want to look stupid. There's all these things that people fear. And so there was all these aspects to fear that became evident as I started to study it, whether it was that type of thing or some other. There's 9 different subcategories under fear. And then as you look as the assumptions are really that voice in your head. And we tell ourselves, the last time I asked a question, they made me head of that department and I didn't get any money. And you talk yourself out of it. Or the last time I researched whatever, I didn't think it was interesting. Or the last time I did something, somebody did this, or I'm not smart enough. It's too much trouble. And you get into these ruminating weirdo things in your head that keep you instead of just diving in. And they could lead to fear. And so they can one lead to another. And the one that kind of surprised me was technology, because I hadn't really thought about that one as much. And it kept coming up. And it's really over and underutilization of it. So if you gave Einstein a calculator but never taught him the math, he might be a great calculator worker, but then we need to give him the math. So a lot of people are behind. They haven't found the foundation that they need in technology. And people like you who tell me that they're super curious, sometimes they find technology was a surprise to them because they like it, but then they really don't have the foundation, or they use it too much and they do different things. So we have the Wozniaks who are high tech, but a lot of that is due to his environment, which environment can work against you more than it works for you often. And teachers have to teach to the test. It's not their fault. They have guidelines. They can't answer every question. Your parent, you better be in this job. This is what we always did. Your family, like I mentioned, social media. You don't want to post something and it looks stupid. Nobody liked it. I'm going to take it down. Everybody with whom you've ever had interactions is your environment, and your current boss, your past boss. And leaders who are listening to this don't know what your past boss said to you, right? They know what they've said to you, and it's all been perfect in their mind. But the last guy or gal put a big monkey wrench in everything. So we don't know. So what we have to do is look at these 4 factors and answer these 36 questions and get an idea. Okay, so now I know it's this. And I hadn't thought about that before. And now I know that I can do a personal SWOT analysis of sorts and have ways to overcome my weaknesses of breadth and then make it measurable and just goals. It's not that different from doing an engagement survey where you find out, and we know everybody's lacking engagement in the workplace, not everybody, but a high percentage. And if we're losing $550 billion a year in the US alone, that's a huge reason to find out what's inhibiting people, because if we could fix this, it's a big value. And that research I just did, I haven't published yet, but I will, is showing that a lot of leaders have really found value financially with improving engagement, improving innovation, ultimately improving productivity. Because no matter who I asked on my show, I don't care what kind of expert they were, if they were a creativity expert or innovation expert or whatever, they all said curiosity comes first. So I look at curiosity as the match, the Mission Impossible fuse that you see that has to blow up what we need to do and make us be able to be creative, make us motivated, make us all the soft skills that everybody's struggling with, all the issues of communication and conflict and turnover and everything all keeps coming back to curiosity. And if you have that thought process, like I mentioned Olin Otakoven did when he would hire people and then base jobs around them, you have this, let's let people explore and see what they're good at. And if we could do that, not everybody's going to want to clean floors, of course, because that's not that great. If you look at what Disney did, they asked their people in their laundry division where they're having tons of turnover, how can we make your job better? Thinking they're not going to get really great feedback, because who wants to do that job in their mind, probably, right? But they got great feedback saying, just put an air vent over my desk so I'm not so hot, make my table go up and down so my back doesn't hurt. And they saved over $100,000. So it's just asking the questions. And that's what I do when I go to organizations. We talk first about their results. Here's what you found, and here's how you create your action plan. And we do all that. We whiteboard all their issues. But then the second half of the training class, we just fix all the issues that leaders have, which I think is really fascinating, because once they know how to solve their own problems, they're like the Disney employees who answered the survey of how can we make your job better? And they make it better by giving, if leadership, before I have the training classes, I ask leaders, what are you struggling with? And if communication is the problem, then I get all kinds of feedback about how to improve communication with building curiosity. Or if it's something else, you find out innovation. So you're going to the horse's mouth like they did there, and then you're whiteboarding all these great ideas. You're putting it together. You're giving it back to leadership. They've done a lot of the work for you of what you're trying to solve. Now leaders pick and choose what they think they can do and can't do, but it's so important to get that kind of feedback, because leaders are in a totally different realm than what the day-to-day is. And so they often don't know a lot of that stuff. And if you don't ask, you're not going to find out.
Tying this into my trip to Normandy, it renewed my appreciation for World War II and everything that happened in that war. And I learned something among all the books I've read about World War II, that one of the reasons why they think Hitler lost the war is because the same reason you just brought it up, and that's why I'm talking about it, is no one wanted to bring him bad news.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if he's losing a war on the front. They would always saying, everything's going great, golly gee. And they think that's part of the reason why, because he would kill people who brought bad news. So it doesn't take too many people to go, hey, don't tell this guy bad news anymore.
Right, yeah. Yes. It's not that different. That Travis Bradbury had some data he had shared. I remember about CEOs getting lower emotional intelligence levels as they got up in rank. And a lot of it is because you're around yes men, yes women, and you're having fewer conversations that are meaningful, because no one's going to tell you what you don't want to hear. And that's one thing I really loved about Keith Kroc. And I still work on his board at Purdue and do some stuff with him. He wrote the foreword in my first book. And he was the CEO and chairman of DocuSign when I was on the board at DocuSign with him at the board of advisors. And he had 250 people on this board, I think. I don't know. They were just all, I was just in awe when I'd sit there. It was all CEOs from, McDonald's and every place you could think of that had a name, that is Sony or whatever. And those are examples. I'm not sure those are exactly the ones, but they were all really big companies. And I remember he would just say, I can't know everything. And if I surround myself with people who have the knowledge I don't know, I think that's really important, to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you are. And if you're the smartest person in the room, you're not getting anywhere. It's just the worst thing to do.
When I was going to college, I went to the Rochester Institute of Technology, and I was working at a steel factory to put my way through college. They had this thing where you could borrow books on tape, and they were really books on tape. But I remember listening to an audiobook about Lee Iacocca when he was at Chrysler. He used to park in the Union parking lot and walk through the Union shop talking to all these people. And as you're talking about curiosity, I'm like, he was really curious because he didn't sit up in his ivory tower. He was actually on the floor talking to the union guys.
That's so important, because I actually worked in a company where all the leaders sat on the top floor, and you needed a key to get off the elevator. That's where to get in the door of their suite, and they didn't come down. You're just sending a huge message. And when I interviewed somebody like Doug Connick, for example, who turns Campbell Soup around, he was just so different. He went and talked to people, found out about him, and then he wrote them handwritten note thanking them. He wrote over 30,000 notes in his time with Campbell Soup, but he totally turned around their engagement. And he's like the nicest guy. He's very interesting to interview. I've interviewed him twice. And, when I talk to him, Tom Peters, all the people I've talked to on my show, it's about getting there, talking to people, asking questions. They all say that if you're sitting up on that ivory floor, not coming down, talking to people, that's sending a huge culture message that you're there, we're here, and that's the worst thing you can do.
When I was at my last corporate job back in 2005, the one that fired me, not for anything nefarious, okay? That's how that's how I became where I am today. They decided that the old inventory software, I was in inventory control management, we need to replace it. Now, the smart thing would be, hey, let's get involved. Let's get the people on the front lines who are going to use the software to be involved. Nope. They just said, here you go. And then when our productivity went down, they're like, we don't understand what's going on. We were using A, now we're using B. There's a big learning curve. And it took about, I think, 9 months before people started getting the groove again, because this wasn't like similar. It was totally different. But had they involved the people on the front lines and said, hey, this software is they're not updating anymore. We have to update, but we want your input because you use it all the time. I think it would have been easier, but they just thrust it at us and we were just like a deer in the headlights.
Happens all the time. It just happens all the time. And that's what I was talking about. When leaders don't question or let people put their feedback in, they're just throwing darts sometimes of what they think, or they're listening to other salespeople say, this is what you need. And sometimes you do need it. Sometimes you get lucky and you don't know, but getting feedback. And that's why when I do that second half of my training, because I think that's probably the most important half it sometimes, is getting leaders the feedback that they need to make decisions like that of what we need to fix and what the employees think is wrong and what. Because people don't want to tell you that. They're not going to tell you that. They have to have it in a very anonymous format. And they don't feel comfortable putting their name behind a lot of this stuff. And you know why? Because the ramifications. It's a very safe way to do it through a third party like that. If leaders come up to you and ask you, what do you think? Oh, yeah, everything's great. You're going to just say it's great.
How do when you give in the second half of your training and you talk to the leaders and give them feedback, would you say that some of them are acceptable to it and they want to learn, they really want to go take their company next level, with other people are like, hey, I'm the leader. This is not a slave master and slave relationship. This is like, you're leading these people and they really want to make this company good. So do you have people on both sides of the aisle there?
That's a great question, because I think one of the first sentences in one of my books is like an emotional intelligence book. If you need to read it, you probably aren't picking up shelf. And this is so important that leaders embrace curiosity from the top. And the companies who hire me, that hire me, I should say, have leaders who usually see a value in curiosity, even if they don't know how much they embrace it yet. The ones who think it's my way or the highway aren't likely going to hire somebody to change the culture to a culture of curiosity. It's just the way it is. And they're not going to be leaders for much longer. I think a lot of them are starting to see the importance of this. And so, yes, those new to the idea are going to sometimes go, why do I have to do this? And those are going to, people who argue it are going to end up having the RIM BlackBerry products, and they're going to be gone. And so now that they've seen that there's this huge change with AI and everything going on, everybody wants to be relevant. They want to be innovative, and they're not doing the same old things from the past. I've given a lot of personality assessments. I've given Myers-Briggs and DISC and whatever was popular at the time, and they're great. But you need to be relevant at this point, and you need to give assessments that give you engagement data. They give you curiosity data. You get cultural change information, because if you're saying and doing what you were doing in the past, it's just over for you.
One of the people I really admire, and you've already mentioned his coworker, Wozniak, Steve Jobs, very curious.
Yeah.
But I heard that when it comes to leadership, I remember, I think it was in Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs, he was talking, there's a meeting, and he was talking about the iPad or something like that. And as he's talking, he stopped and he noticed a woman that he didn't recognize. He goes, "What are you doing here?" And my boss wanted me here. He goes, "We won't be needing you." And he told her to leave. And I'm like, yikes. He was curious, but I heard in terms of his personality skills or personal skills, not so much.
You bring it up because there's a great point, because when I asked Daniel Goleman about him, the emotional intelligence aspect of him, which is what you're really referring to here, is his interpersonal skills and his lack thereof sometimes. There's actually two different versions of him, people say. The first time he was at Apple, then got fired and humbled, and the second time he was at Apple. But just like with my curiosity information, there's different aspects of emotional intelligence. And so he was really good at some of it. Like, he knew more about empathy in some ways, that knowing what you would like in a product and what people would really find interesting. But then when it came to the empathy part of I care if I hurt your feelings part, it wasn't great. You know what I mean? So it was interesting to talk to Daniel about different people. He was talking about Clinton and a few people of, you think maybe he's not so emotionally intelligent from the decisions he made with the women or whatever he did. But he said he was really great at making you feel, Clinton now, as you were the only person in the room and everything that you said really mattered. So I think we can all be really great in some aspects of emotional intelligence, curiosity, and other behavioral soft skill areas, but then not all of them. And it's everybody can improve in everything, right? So we want to just always be striving to be a better version of ourselves, not of somebody else. You start with your own baseline, not somebody else's own baseline, and you get a good grasp of where I am and how I can improve. And it's just a constant striving for that.
I am all Apple. I have every Apple product you can imagine. And I was sad when Steve Jobs died and gave the reins before he died. Obviously, it'd be weird to give him the reins after he died to Tim Cook, because I wish he would have gone with Johnny Ives, because again, in Walter Isaacson's books, Steve Jobs would spend like hours in the locked laboratory with Johnny Ive. He was very curious. He wanted to create products that would wow the world, where Tim Cook's a money guy. And I don't think Tim Cook, in my opinion, Mark Stachewski's opinion, I think they should have gone with Johnny Ive instead of Tim Cook, because Tim Cook, I don't think he has any personality. I think he's a robot. I think he's AI. I think he's the first generation AI, in my opinion. But I just think Johnny Ive, obviously very curious. Wozniak, very curious. Steve Jobs, really curious. But it's interesting that Steve Jobs would turn it over to Tim Cook, who appears to me not to be as curious.
It's really interesting. My son-in-law works at Apple, and I ask him all these kind of questions, and he says he can't tell me or he'd have to kill me. So I never could find out from him. But I do ask a lot of people different aspects of Apple, and you get a little bit here and there. I think that Cook has done a good job with the reins. He's managed to do a lot of great things. But I think that you don't know just because of their personality, how much of their thoughts are strategic. You know what I mean? There's strategic thinkers and tactical thinkers, right? And the tactical make great managers, and the strategic make great leaders. And I don't know Cook, obviously I haven't met him, and he may have more of that strategic thinking that Steve valued. And you just don't know what's behind his thoughts of why he picked him. But I think that Wozniak, you need the people that'll climb the hill and get to the other side for you. And that was Wozniak. He would create, he would do, and I think Jobs was better at the overall, I'm going to come up with this great idea. I don't think there's going to be anybody that could have replaced Steve Jobs. It's like Elon. There's a brain behind what they are, whether you like them or hate them, that makes them who they are. And who would replace him? Nobody's really going to be like that. So I think Steve must have found something in Cook that he thought was a better fit. And without him around, I guess we won't know.
You bring up Elon, a very divisive character. I think it has to do with because he's very, I read his book on Walter Isaacson as well. He's very pro free speech and stuff like that. I think people who are saying, I hate X, the dumb name, I'm going to leave. He didn't get to be who he is by not being successful. I think in the next, and I said this before, 6 to 18 months, you're going to see X is going to be the number one platform you need to be on. What he's working on behind the scenes, I really like where he's going. And the thing is, people, it's not the way it was before, so I don't like it. Open your mind. Maybe could be a good thing. And I think that's part of the reason why when people tell me, I have a lot of friends who are LinkedIn only people, that's the only platform they're on, and they're like, X is just nothing but a cesspool. I'm like, there's people who are regular content creators on X that are killing it. And they're not doing the political stuff. They're just like talking about productivity or writing or whatever like that. But I think Elon Musk is a lot smarter than people are giving him credit for. Just read this book from Walter Isaacson.
Yeah, I did.
He's a very smart man. To your point, you don't get to be where he is being stupid.
No, and I think if he does his overall vision, like what he was talking about and what they've mentioned in the book, I think it could be something really big. And I think when you say the people, they like the way it was before, that's that status quo thinking. And change is painful sometimes. And I've never been as much on Twitter, but I do use Twitter. I use all of the platforms, usually as much as I can. But I think you need to be where your audience is. And and so a lot of people with whom I deal, they are on LinkedIn because of that, because they're consultants or they're whatever they do, and they're in the business realm. But when I teach marketing courses, I'm having all my students online looking at the tweet updates to see what's happening with their products. And it just depends what you're looking for. If I'm watching the Super Bowl, I'm on Twitter. I want to see what everybody's complaining. Oh boy, how they sing. I don't know. What was that play? And you're going to look wherever it just is so varied based on what you're doing.
100%. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about someone. And they said, I'm not. I said, you on TikTok? I have over 1,400 followers on TikTok. I don't do any dancing, singing. I just give productivity tips. And I was telling this person, they go, my audience is on LinkedIn. I said, you don't think the C-suite is not on TikTok? I said, Kevin O'Leary has been on TV saying TikTok is the number one platform. Big juggernauts are on TikTok. Now, they may not be John Doe CEO on TikTok. They may be, Uncle Fred 4545. But I promise you, the people who are in the know in leadership are on TikTok. They're probably not using their real name, but they're on TikTok. And they're probably also on Meta. They're probably also on YouTube. They're probably also on X. You call it Twitter. I'm true black, because they changed the color, Elon Musk. I'm on Team X. So that's okay. I get your point. But I just think that very few people are only on one platform. I love Snapchat, and I only use it for video DMs. So I have one that's a CPA, COO. I video DM her every day. My cousin's an IT person. I've got another person who's like an executive. These are executives. I'm video DMing on Snapchat. So yeah, it does trend low, but I don't use it for posting like that. I use it for video DMs. And I follow the Gary Vaynerchuk model. I post everywhere because I never know where someone's going to see a piece of content and go, holy crap, I need that guy's help. But if you're only on one platform, I think you're restricting yourself. Now, am I saying you have to be on all platforms? I'm like, no, if you can't do it, then don't do it. But I choose to do it. And I think you got to understand that there's a lot of opportunity out there. And if you don't know TikTok or X or Snapchat, get curious and go find out about it. And if you don't like it, you can quit it. No one's going to come to your house and knock on your door. But I think that also plays in this. Are you curious about a new platform like Threads? I think Threads is going to die. They're trying to copy the former Twitter, which is now X. I don't think it's going to be successful because I see people put the same content on X. They'll get like 1,000 comments. They'll put the same comment on Threads and get one. These are big influencers. I think Threads is...
There's not as many people on Threads yet. And then I think that was a backup bet. If X goes down, you have Threads.
Yeah.
No, I think it depends what happens with X to see what happens with Threads. In my opinion, I'm on both. I do both just for the sake of who knows where it's going to go.
Yep.
But I agree with you. And I think that it'll be interesting. I think it's very challenging for people to be on multiple platforms. And there's ways to post on all platforms from one software package if people don't want to go through the hassle of learning different ones. But I agree with you. I think you should learn different ones because it's interesting to see where your people are. First of all, who's interacting with you and where your messages resonate. And what's interesting, even on LinkedIn, though, if I post a picture, it's turning into a little bit like Facebook in some ways that people are tired of hearing business stuff.
Yep.
And I'll get 100,000 something views for a picture I happen to put in my daughter's wedding or something. And I've never put stuff like that on LinkedIn. If I do it once, wow. So I don't know if they'll all change and more. And they will, because they're not going to all stay static. And LinkedIn's changed dramatically since I did my radio show when I first started doing it. And it's a great platform for what my purposes are. So I prefer LinkedIn of all of them for what I do.
What I do is people ask me, how do you post on all the social media platforms? First of all, my wife works for me. So not for me.
Yeah, that's
she's going to edit this podcast. She works with me. So she creates all these videos and podcasts, like she'll take this and stuff like that and make videos out of it. And then she'll schedule on X and on Meta and on YouTube and on TikTok. So I don't have to do that. So I'm taking the same content. I'm not creating specific content for other platforms. So that makes it a lot easier. Plus, I've been creating video content since 2011. So I got tons of content. So it's something I choose to do. If you're new, pick a platform, then pick a second one and stair step it. All right, we're almost out of time, but I got 2 questions to ask you. The first question is, you gave us a lot to think about in the show today. Like talking to you is like listening to you drinking from a fire hose. So if you had to pick one thing you want to make sure someone listens to this whole podcast and, oh my gosh, now you can re-listen to it. That's the good news. You can rewatch it or re-listen to it again. But what is one piece of information you want to make sure that people leave this show with?
I think it's so important to recognize that you don't know what you don't know, and you need to get a mentor of some sort who is smarter than you in some ways, and get outside, maybe 360 feedback, and just continuous learning and exploration is important. And of course, the most important thing to me is to find out what holds you back, because you can't move forward without knowing what's stopping you.
100%. And the final question is, where can we find out more about what you're doing in the world? Or to give a nod to Steve Jobs, where are you putting a dent in the universe?
I am putting a dent on my website, which is drdianehamilton.com, which is just my name, DR as for doctor. But if you can go directly to the curiosity information, just going to curiositycode.com, but that still gets you to that same site, but just the curiosity section. But I have a ton of information there. And my new book should be coming out sometime in July, I understand, probably towards the end of July of 2024. And it's going to be I'm super excited about it because there's nothing like it. And it's got so much content that I think a lot of people could benefit from.
I'm so happy you're coming out with another book. People who write books, I love reading books. And if I could find somebody, maybe I'll contact Elon Musk. I just want $5 million a year, and all I have to do is read books. That's all. Because I've got so many books on my Kindle, so many hard copy books. I just want to read, but I limit myself to 1 hour a day because I got to work on my business. But I love reading. Reading, can you imagine if you sat down, you took who's not on social media, ironically, and you buy his book for $20. But if he sat down and got on a Zoom call with you and read his book, it'd be a lot more than $20. So I don't think people understand the power of a book like yours, that you're taking the best of your information and pouring it into a book. But one of my favorite authors, Robin Sharma, says, stop reading books and start studying them. See, we read through the book so fast, we go to the next book. No, stop and actually listen to what the author's teaching you. I love books, which is ironic because up until 15 years ago, I'm 59, I hated reading. Now it's like a drug for me. I can't read enough books.
That's awesome. I think it's a really good practice. And if you don't read books, sometimes it's because you forget to do it. And sometimes I use Google Calendar for everything, and to remind myself to just put a little note on your calendar to remind yourself to do a little bit.
That's what I do. Now I put in 1 to 2, read, that way it happens. So
mark it out, make some time.
Diane, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. It was an honor to have you on the show. I learned so much. I took a boatload of notes, and I'm excited about it. And I just want to encourage the audience. Hey, 2 things. Number 1, get curious. If you're already curious, get curiouser. Okay. And number 2 things. Go to drdianehamilton.com. And then when you're done with her site, hop on over to my site, mrproductivity.com. Wealth of information on both sites. Diane, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. I loved it. And thanks for teaching me something new about how to get the microphone to work.